Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 287. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and today I am back with the BJJ Mental Models prodigal son, one of our first guests ever, many years ago, back again in the saddle, Cal McDonald. Cal, how is it going, sir?
Doing fantastic, especially after that introduction. Thank you very much, Steve. That's an overstatement if I've ever heard one, but, appreciate it.
Gotta overstate, man. That's part of running a podcast, is you gotta make big, flamboyant, over-the-top statements, right? Gotta go for that engagement.
Okay, I'll work on doing that throughout this.
Well, I'll give you the steering wheel here then. That's probably as good a time as any. I think the last time you were on the podcast here was, it feels like it must have been 4 years ago. So many people probably didn't hear the first chat we had, which to this day, I think is an incredible conversation. So maybe give yourself a quick intro for people who haven't heard you speak before.
Definitely. Well, I appreciate that. And the last time I was on the podcast, I frankly just stole all of the most useful information that I thought I could share and then just sort of said it verbatim, to your audience. So hopefully some people got some value out of that. So I'm Cal. I used to coach full-time at Island Top Team. So as an instructor under Rob Biernacki, I coached under him for about 7 years. And a good portion of that time, I was a full-time coach. So I developed a youth program that, I taught a couple classes per day throughout the week to kids who were as young as 4 all the way up to about 16, 17. And I also coached the adult program primarily during the day at noon and in the mornings. So in the adult program, I would typically follow Rob's curriculum that he promotes through BJJ Concepts. And in the youth program, I was able to spend quite a bit of time developing sort of my own methods and also in dealing with different students, right? With dealing with youth, it's a bit different from adults. I would summarize it as kids are essentially just adults with shorter attention span for the purposes of coaching. But that's the majority of my jiu-jitsu background. I'm a black belt. I've been a black belt for, handful of years now, coming up on my 2nd degree. Pretty exciting. These days, I don't train nearly as much as I used to. I used to train virtually every day of the week or as frequently as I could. I ended up with something called post-concussion syndrome, which put me on the sidelines for, a full about 1.5 years of virtually no training, when I did spend a lot of time learning about the information that I get to share with you today. And then the last couple of years, I've been slowly getting back into it, slowly building myself back up. It's been a long road, but I'm happy to be where I'm at. And I think that's a pretty thorough breakdown of my experience in jiu-jitsu.
And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you have a new instructional out with friend of the show, Stephan Kesting, correct?
I do. So I was super fortunate to work with Stephan on, an instructional that is positioned as a tool to learn jiu-jitsu from day one or to help you develop a curriculum for beginners. So I really see it as the most effective way to be introduced to jiu-jitsu. What do you want to learn from day one in terms of concepts and principles, but also the actual movements? If I had to position it somewhere in today's sort of dichotomy between information processing and the ecological approach, I would say it's a little bit closer to that active practice of sort of eco, but it relies somewhere in the middle and it doesn't really adhere to any specific ideas too rigidly. But it's for beginners or coaches who want some material to either change up their classes or know that what they're providing to their students is very high percentage and effective techniques for people to learn from day one so they can grow effectively from that point.
Amazing. And as I always do, I will link that in the show notes. I think people probably know that when it comes to instructionals, Stephan Kesting's Grapplearts is my number one recommendation. If you've ever bought a Grapplearts instructional and compared it to the alternatives out there through things like BJJ Fanatics, the one thing that will stand out is that the quality on Grapplearts is just so much higher. Stephan and his team put so much effort into organizing and structuring that material. I've just always relied heavily on Stephan's stuff. And, usually he's got some incredible deals and incredible prices that make it really worthwhile, especially when you compare it to other options. So I will put a link in the show notes. But before we get into that, maybe we can talk about how we got to this point, Cal, because as you mentioned, you've been dealing with post-concussion syndrome, and that journey has taken you on a kind of a research path to the point where we're going to talk about this topic today. I remember the last time you were on, I think you had just recently had the concussion that triggered this. And I mean, I don't know if you want me to say this or not. Tell me if you want me to cut this out. But I remember when we were recording, after we stopped that last time, you told me that during the conversation, you got so excited that your nose started bleeding. And that scared the bejesus out of me, man. I don't want anyone to die because of BJJ Mental Models. But anyway, tell me about this journey. And I think, honestly, this is probably a topic we should cover at some point as well. Just what, concussions look like, the impact of those, and restructuring your life to make jiu-jitsu fun rather than a chore. But I'll turn this over to you. Why don't you kind of explain the journey that you've had over the last few years since we talked and how that leads into the topic we're going to get into today?
Totally. I mean, on the note of the nosebleed, Steve, you're kind of a big deal. I'm on your podcast here. The nerves can get going, so maybe it was just that. Maybe I was starstruck and I just couldn't hold it together. I started bleeding from the nose. So around that time, basically what happened was I was coaching a class, and out of virtually nowhere, I got these symptoms. I was completely off balance. So it was a vertigo type scenario. I started having blind spots or like light spots in my vision. I was crazy tired, like super fatigued out of absolutely nowhere. And I had to take a step away. Luckily, there was another instructor there who took over the class, and I took a step away and I was like, oh my God, like I'm so disoriented. Something I'd never experienced before. Nothing came even remotely close to this. Went to the hospital. I was told verbatim, this is a inexplicable neurological phenomenon. You're very healthy. Don't worry about it. You'll probably feel perfectly fine by tomorrow or within a few days. So I go home and I'm just absolutely out of it, exhausted again, off balance, a lot of different symptoms that made it hard to function. A couple weeks later, I don't know if I waited that long. I probably did. It was probably at least a couple weeks later. I ended up, going to the hospital, going to the doctor's office. I made repeat visits, and eventually I was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome. Long story short, I'd been in a really bad car accident years ago. They think that's related, plus probably a combination of overtraining and getting my head bumped a few too many times. Post-concussion syndrome basically means when you get a concussion, your brain should be healed within a few weeks. You should no longer experience symptoms, generally speaking, after a few weeks. If you experience symptoms after that time, generally you're put into a group called, you have post-concussion syndrome. And the idea is most people make a full recovery after about a 5-year period. I'm coming up on 4 years. I feel like I'm well on my way to a full recovery. And the first 9 months were pretty devastating. Like, you couldn't really do much. You're pretty much laying in bed. I did do a decent amount of reading, which is when I got heavily involved into sort of neuroscience, the brain, and understanding what was going on there. So I wanted to learn about my experience, but I've always had a huge passion for teaching, coaching, and learning. Really effective learning has always been something that I found incredibly interesting. So when I was on the show last, the information that I presented, it was the best of what I had at the time. And it essentially came down to the tools that were available or the resources that were available around learning, primarily focused on cognitive learning strategies. So learning things that would be helpful, for example, in like a traditional school setting. So someone tells you some information or you read some information and you want to memorize that. You want to keep that in your memory. So topics like, history or physics, things like that, where it's all in your cognitive brain, things that you can express to other people and they can express to you. And so there are certain strategies that we know are effective in developing those memories. So for example, the things that I went over in the first podcast primarily relate to effortful retrieval. So if Steve, if you were to say something to me now, mention a fact to me, like give me something, give me a fact, give me something.
The capital of British Columbia is Victoria.
Wonderful. So if I say perfect, and then you're like, Cal, what's the capital of British Columbia? I'm like, it's Victoria. Obviously, it's on the tip of my tongue. I want to wait until I've almost forgot what you told me. I want to wait. Obviously that's going to be kind of challenging to do, but the general idea is in like 2 weeks' time, if I didn't already know that and it wasn't so well ingrained, then I would try to recall that memory. And the more effortful that retrieval is, but I'm still able to retrieve that memory, the more enduring that learning is. Okay. So anytime you're learning something cognitively, retrieval and effortful retrieval, it kind of sits at the top of the pyramid in terms of what's effective to build those memories. Following that, things like cognitive load, where we recognize that you can only hold a certain number of things in your short-term memory at one time. And so we want to optimize how many things you're actually trying to process at once. And then what we do is, let's say we learn 3 things. Let's say we're learning, you're on your first day of jiu-jitsu and you're seated in front of your training partner. They're standing in front of you. And your coach tells you, let's say they want the top player to pass the bottom player. So this is one idea in your mind, okay? Top player, you want to pass. Bottom player, you don't want to allow them to pass. We can probably agree that could be one idea. And then the bottom player is going to use frames, so just locking out their skeleton in a variety of ways to prevent the top player from passing. And the top player is going to then use those frames. It's going to access one of those frames and they're going to turn it into a lever. All right, that might be a lot of information depending on how much you already know. But for some people, that would be approximately 3 things, right? It's like, I want to pass the guard. He wants to use frames. I want to use levers. And now we have a game. So that's 3 ideas that I can hold in my mind at once. After I've practiced that for some period of time, it's likely that this can become one chunk. So those 3 things are now more like one thing. And now I can build off that and say, okay, let's add 2 new pieces of information. And we can process that new information until it again becomes more of one chunk. And then we build off that continuously. So that's another good tool for the cognitive approach to learning. The next piece would be interleaving, which would be, we did a game where it was passing and guard retention. And now the next thing we do might involve sweeping or controlling the back or controlling the mount. Whatever the case is, we move to a different skill and then eventually move back to that first skill we practiced. And interleaving different activities has proven to be effective in long-term, more enduring learning. And the reason for that is essentially you're bringing these memories to the surface. There are a variety of ways of explaining it, but you're bringing these memories to the surface, and it's that recall of those memories, the effortful retrieval, that results in that long-term, more durable learning. Okay, so that was the last time we were on the podcast. Honestly, at the time, I didn't really even recognize that those learning strategies were more so relevant when it came to cognitive learning. It was just learning strategies that I learned about that I thought would be applicable to really any learning. That brings us to where we are today. Through the process of having my post-concussion syndrome, I got really involved in learning about the brain. I went through a wild number of books, anything I could get my hands on to try to learn more about what was happening there. And what really ended up happening in that process was, hey, you know what? I'm really interested in the learning side of things, the coaching side of things. How can I apply what I'm starting to learn about how the brain works and apply this to my coaching or my own learning, right? And so what it ends up breaking down to is a different form of memory system. The cognitive memory system's on one side. So again, you're retrieving things that you've previously learned that you can express to another person or they can express to you. You're using your cognitive brain. You can think about it. By contrast, the procedural memory system, it's not something that you consciously think of. It doesn't involve your conscious thought, all right? It is what you might refer to as muscle memory, which I think is a bit of a misnomer and can make this stuff a little bit more complicated. But essentially, the procedural memory system is memories that you develop through practice that are not conscious. And this is relevant because just like there are learning methods for cognitive memories, there are also effective ways for developing that procedural memory system, that non-cognitive memory system. So I'll take a little pause here and Steve, help me out. Where should we be going next?
Well, the first thing that I would add here, of course, and I always want to add this disclaimer when we kind of get deep into the reeds of science here, is to add the disclaimer that, to the best of my knowledge, neither of us are actual scientists. So we are just a bunch of dumb pajama wrestlers who have read some books and are trying to figure out the ways to interpret that in the context of jiu-jitsu. This stuff seems to work, at least for you and for me. But that said, do not take this as definitive fact. You know, a lot of the time people will bring in things that they've read from the scientific community and try to apply them to jiu-jitsu. Sometimes that's not an exact application and it doesn't kind of shake out perfectly. So please do take this conversation as semi-informed advice, but please do not take it as a definitive scientific way of the optimal way to train jiu-jitsu, because to the best of my knowledge, that bridge into how this stuff applies to jiu-jitsu has not been formally studied to the extent that we may want it to be. So I would just always put that disclaimer there. This is just informed advice, not scientific fact. But that said, I have some thoughts on how we could kind of expand on that. Now, recently, Daniel Kahneman passed away, famous Nobel Prize winning scientist, and he wrote a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Honestly, it's a bit of a dry read and it's a bit long, but the big takeaway is that in that book, he proposes that he's got this mental model of two systems decision making. And he basically proposes that there is this kind of base level of the brain, which is more automatic. That's kind of where things just happen. And we might not even really be aware or even in control of how they're happening. And then we've got the cognitive layer above that. And that's where the big deep thinking happens. And there's this interplay between these two quote unquote systems. And now granted, this is just an abstraction that he provides. And where this is relevant to jiu-jitsu is we want to grapple in automatic mode. We don't want to be sitting there grappling and having to think deliberately about every single thing that happens, because so much of good grappling is about reaction time. It's about making quality decisions and making those quality decisions as fast as you possibly can. Probably one of the most specific jiu-jitsu examples that we can quote is the legendary quote from Salo Ribeiro. Probably most people who have trained have heard this, but he says, if you think you are late, if you are late, you use strength. If you use strength, you tire. And if you tire, you die. And what that basically means is you want to grapple without thinking, because if you have to stop and think about everything you do, you're already behind the curve. And now your opponent has control of the pace, and now it's up to you to kind of make up, and that's when you start making dumb mistakes. Are we talking about the same thing here? Is that kind of the same application of what you're discussing, or am I just totally off into left field at this point?
No, I think you're nailing it, and I just want to echo your sentiment. I'm just some guy who rolls around on the mat and has read a bunch of books, and I do genuinely think that this conversation is beneficial to the community at large, because I don't find that people are looking at coaching and learning through this particular mental model or this lens, if you will. But just, echoing the fact that I'm certainly not an expert at this, and I want to bring this information, and I want to make sure I draw a line where, I'm not overstepping too grossly. But yes, absolutely. And on that note, when you mention, if you think you're late, that sort of quote, I think it's important to make a distinction here that in the learning process, you're absolutely able to leverage that thinking process in order to build a training environment that allows you to be effective. So, for example, if I want to learn how to do a particular guard pass, if my coach says, hey, this is something I talked about the other day, we're going to go over the knee cut guard pass, right? And that phrase, right? Knee cut. This can be something that's a little more contentious in today's environment where we have different methods of looking at jiu-jitsu. The term knee cut is a chunk, okay? It is a number of things put together to explain something that's happening. You're essentially cutting between the bottom player's legs, leading with your knee, more or less. And that's how you're looking to get past somebody's legs, right? So in the process of learning, you can actually you can think in the training room. You're thinking, what do I do next? I'm on their back. What do I do? What do I do? If you want to make your movements as quick as possible and as efficient as possible, then the idea is to take it away from that cognitive mode and bring it more into that procedural memory system that's much more automatized. Is automatized? Is that a word?
It is now.
There we go. We created it. Just like all this information.
Well, what's interesting is one of the only people other than you who I've seen who has discussed this in the context of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is Josh Waitzkin. And he did not necessarily discuss it from the perspective of the science, but he has this idea that he calls form to leave form, which he talks about in The Art of Learning. And the idea is you practice the movements and the forms and the repetitions to the point where they no longer require conscious thought to execute. They basically become automatic. Part of the reason you do that is because that's how you improve your reaction time and make good decisions quicker. But the other reason why that's helpful is because if you abstract an idea, now you can use that idea as a building block that you can build on top of for more complex, higher level ideas. And that's kind of how you evolve from the point of having to just be overwhelmed by all of the details about where your arms and legs go to the point where you can be thinking about high-level strategy while you're actually grappling. An example I would give here, everyone who remembers their first few months of jiu-jitsu probably remembers just being completely overwhelmed and being unable to do anything, not because they didn't remember what they were told to do, but because they simply couldn't do it fast enough. At that point, for example, when you're starting off, an arm bar is still fresh information to you. You're probably still obsessively trying to remember the 10 steps to do this thing correctly, and you just can't make them happen quickly enough, and you don't have the context to know, well, what do I do if he zigs when I expected him to zag? But if you train enough, then eventually all of those steps and variations and what ifs, they kind of glob together into your mind into this concept that we call an arm bar. And I can talk to you and I can tell you, Cal, can you go teach the kids an arm bar? And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain the technique to you. Now, once we've abstracted that knowledge into a repeatable block, we can start chaining it together, and we can talk about how arm bars tie into different sequences and how maybe you can fake something else and go for an arm bar. We would not be able to have those conversations if everyone involved had not already abstracted all of the individual steps that make up an armbar into this bigger idea. So that, to me, is one of the goals of training, is to abstract those things into things that just ideas, mental models that you can pick up and action on much quicker. That's actually the thesis behind the show, so to speak, BJJ Mental Models. We kind of kicked this off because we looked at the work that folks like Josh Waitzkin were doing, pulled in some ideas from other unrelated fields, and I just love this idea of taking complex ideas and boiling them down into a simple, repeatable concept so you can make good decisions faster. That's ultimately what I think we're trying to do here.
Yeah, fantastic. And I like your summary, globbing. That could be the
very
the title
scientific
of the show. Yes, it's perfect. It aligns with our intellectual abilities. So I kind of want to just sort of define these a little bit more in terms of, if you're in practice. So you talked about, type 1, type 2 systems, and you talked about, thinking while you're training and just organizing a practice scenario in whatever way is most effective, right? So this is kind of the lens that I'm looking at this from, and the mental model that I hope makes sense to the listeners and is something that can benefit you moving forward. When, if I'm in class and I have a role with a particular student, and then after the role, they say, hey, you got any feedback for me? Anything that you can provide that might help me in my future roles? And I'll try to dig down and think of something like, hey, I really feel like, when I'm looking to pass your guard, you're not typically engaging with me. You're not being more offensive. Like, they could be hand fighting more, or they could be looking to establish a guard. But a lot of times I find maybe it's just when you go against the higher belt, you're just, I don't know, it throws you off. I've had that experience when I was less experienced. It just throws you off. You're like, they know more than me and they're probably just setting me up. But basically, one experience I have quite frequently is people, they don't actually play an offensive game from guard. They're just immediately okay, I'm going to play guard retention and hope I don't get my guard passed. And so my feedback would be, you need to engage in your guard to actually try to sweep me, attack me from the bottom position, right from the get-go. You don't want to wait for me to attack. And so that's that cognitive system, right? I'm just purely, what's happening is, and I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but you're firing certain neurons. As you listen to that information, certain neurons are firing in your brain, right? That would correspond with certain areas of the brain that have more to do with cognitive thought and processing cognitive thoughts. Those neurons, those structures, are generally speaking different from the ones that you would fire if you were actually practicing the activity. So I can tell them that. I can say, hey, you want to engage in your guard. But if I don't take a moment to say, for example, what guard do you like to play? How do you like to engage from that bottom position? Oh, I usually like to get a 2-on-1 grip, and then I pull myself closer to my opponent, and then I've got some kind of single leg control, for example. Or if the opponent's lower, maybe it's a 2-on-1 and I just move into a butterfly control. Again, we're obviously, for the podcast, everything's cognitive. We're not going to be working on any procedural systems during this conversation. But if I can work with that student to say, okay, what does that look like? Show me what that looks like, what your engagement looks like in that moment for you to make this more offensive. And then they physically perform that movement, right? So the grip that they assume on my wrist with their hands, they're firing certain neurons. Again, generally speaking, different from the ones you're firing when you're having that conversation and using that cognitive system. You're using that procedural system. They scoot towards me. Again, their vision, what they're looking at, you relative to them in space and time, is changing as they move. Their center of gravity, their vestibular system, certain neurons are firing to say, hey, am I off balance? Am I on balance? Where is my body in space and time? What am I feeling? You know, I'm feeling the mat beneath me. I'm feeling my opponent as I get closer to them. So you're firing all these neurons. Again, gross oversimplification, but that's the general idea. Certain neurons are, it's not really neurons that are firing, but anyways, are firing within your brain in different regions. Generally speaking, there is certainly overlap, and I'm not qualified to go into that overlap. But these are, generally speaking, two somewhat disparate things. You can know everything about the concepts behind jiu-jitsu. You can explain it to people, and you can be a phenomenal coach with that knowledge. But you have to, and this might sound redundant, but you actually have to play with those movements to have them work for you in real time. And just so that doesn't sound like the most obvious thing you've ever heard, if we are working on, if I have a challenge, like as a student, right? So let's say I'm working on something, this might be more for intermediate people to have this level of knowledge, but I'm working on like a floating pass position. So I'm on top of my opponent, they're on their back, and my hips are more or less resting on whatever leg they have that's sort of framed directly up at me. Okay, so I'm sort of surfing on top of my opponent with my hips. I'm in a floating pass position-ish. Okay, from that floating pass position, there are a few different primary things that I can do. I could roll over their head, so I could roll into like a front headlock. I could roll into a kimura, so I'm going straight forward. Or I could smash down that leg that's framing me to the left or to the right. So I can shift my center of gravity to smash their knee down as a lever, either to the left or to the right. So if I'm watching anybody who's practicing and they say, hey, I'm having a really hard time from this floating pass position, I can't seem to get anything going, I can say to them like, hey, this is what you're trying to achieve. But that's only going to impact them so much as long as they take that information and then actually go and use that in a practice scenario where they're working on that very specific exchange of how am I going to guide this person's knee from the left to the right? How am I going to move my center of gravity to push their leg from the left to the right? Again, this description is purely cognitive. When I go to practice the movement, I don't necessarily need any of that cognitive information to actually develop the neuronal patterns, the neuronal structures that create the procedural memory that I'll actually use to perform jiu-jitsu. So you could say to a student, hey, put your hips on top of their knee and start leaning your body weight to the left and see what they do. And then as you feel them respond to you leaning to the left, now go to the right and start moving to the right. And then you feel their response. And it's sensing that scenario. So this, like, it kind of, here I go, I'm going to get into this realm. This is sort of like more of the ecological approach. It's like I'm trying to focus more on this environment that I've created, and I'm moving within this environment. My opponent is limited to certain things. I'm limited to certain things, and I'm using the affordances in that environment to allow me to develop those, again, it's such a ridiculous term, but like those neuronal structures, okay? So I'm firing certain neurons in the process of learning, and I don't necessarily have to fire those cognitive neurons to develop that physical skill. But it can be extremely useful to use both, to approach it from a scenario where, hey, there are all these really useful concepts. There are all these really useful ideas that other people have developed before me. I can use those things to create a training environment that allows me to develop the procedural memory system that I'm actually going to use when practicing jiu-jitsu. And to take it a step further, you see these crazy athletes, right, who perform just wild maneuvers. Someone goes for like a double leg and they're like flipping into an arm bar or something like that. And you're like, how do you practice? Like, how do you create a scenario where you're able to replicate a movement like that? So from the lens that we're chatting about right now, and again, recognizing the limits of my own knowledge and, trying to keep this within something that is reasonably proven, the idea would be an athlete performs a movement that's particularly impressive. Like, let's move off. Let's go to like a different sport for different context. You got Michael Jordan, right? If anybody even knows who he is at this point. Jumps up into the air, performs a number of different movements while he's in the air, and ends up getting the ball in the net. And you're like, how is that even remotely possible? How do you practice something like that? Okay, a talent aside, let's bring talent and put it completely to the side, which is a ridiculous move because that's super relevant, and say, okay, once you develop enough procedural memory in a particular way, you can improvise on the spot much more easily because you developed so many connections between so many different neurons within that procedural memory system. So in jiu-jitsu, someone goes to take you down and you end up doing some crazy, like rolling inverted armbar on that person. Because of how much experience I have in that particular exchange, most of what's happening is procedural. It's just happening automatically. Because I don't have to use my cognitive system, hope I'm not losing you, my cognitive system very much because it's so automatized, I can then use what mental bandwidth I have available in that moment to improvise, okay? I might not even have to use my cognitive brain to improvise at that point. That's obviously, again, another simplification, but I could say, hey, my body's going to function automatically because I've practiced these things so much, I don't even have to think about them. But what I could think about is, like tactics or strategy, or, hey, I'm in this position and I know what I'm going to do, but is there something that my opponent's doing that might be opening up an opportunity for me to do something else? So the development of that procedural memory system, not only is it the most useful thing to actually perform the art, but it's also freeing up that mental bandwidth and allowing you to use that as a second layer to benefit you in your approach to whether it's rolling in training or winning in competition.
This is a fun conversation to have because as I've gotten deeper into the jiu-jitsu ranks, this is something I've definitely observed within myself. You get to the point where a lot of those things that you used to have to think very deliberately about, they become automatic. And that can create some interesting implications. One of them is things just kind of start happening on their own. You're doing things by instinct, it feels like. But the other thing is sometimes things become so automatic that you don't even realize that they're happening, or alternatively, you can't explain why they're happening or why they work or why you're doing it. For anyone who's ever gotten to brown or black belt and then had to teach or coach their first jiu-jitsu class, you've probably encountered this where you realize that you've been doing a move for years and years and years, but then when you actually have to stop to think about it and explain it and unpack it piece by piece, you really struggle to do that. It's like how, for example, if I tell you to type in your password or tell you to type something on a keyboard, you can probably do it instinctually. But if I ask you, what letter on the keyboard is to the left of the W, you probably have to stop and think about that because that's not part of the automatic skill set anymore. It just happens, right? And that's one of the fascinating things about human beings. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have definitely had this before where I get so used to typing in phone numbers, I just memorize where they are on the dial pad. But then if someone actually stops and asks me, what's your phone number? Or what's this person's phone number? You might not even know because you're so used to just pressing the buttons without having to think about it. And that has really interesting implications to jiu-jitsu, where sometimes you wind up doing things without even understanding what you're doing or how you're doing them. It's one of the reasons I always recommend to people to get some experience teaching jiu-jitsu, because it will alter the way that you think about jiu-jitsu so much when you have to actually stop and explain why you're doing what you're doing. And what you might even discover is some of the things that you're doing actually have no purpose, but you just do them because you've always been doing them, and maybe there's actually no good reason to do them at all. So that's one of the reasons why I always encourage people to teach, because you will get so much value out of having to stop, pull that information out of your quote-unquote muscle memory and think about it and express it cognitively again. It can be very hard to do, and I've definitely seen people struggle with that on this podcast. You can get amazing elite tier grapplers, but when you pull them off the mats and you turn off the camera and you tell them, use your words to explain what you're doing, a lot of them struggle tremendously to do that. And I think it's for the reasons that you've described.
I couldn't agree more in terms of coaching. I think that's, it's common across really any practice. If you start coaching it, it gives you a whole new lens from which to view your own practice. And I've had that experience in a number of different, areas within life, particularly in jiu-jitsu. So completely agreeing with you there. And I do think it's worth it to sort of mention as well, like just to keep this concrete and actionable in terms of developing that system where you're not having to think, what is the method? What is the approach? How should you structure your training, right? I don't think it's so much about the method that you're using in your training to achieve the results, right? It's just about developing that level of skill, developing the ability to spar live against other opponents. Like that's really what we're trying to do, right? And so I know that at least one thing that applies in this scenario has to do with deliberate practice as it relates to the procedural memory system. So the idea is, ideally, when you start learning jiu-jitsu, you learn something kind of basic, right? A movement. For example, moving side to side from a standing position. If I want to pass your guard, you could do it in a variety of ways, but if I start moving left and right, I just start moving to the right. You start reacting to me. As soon as you react to me, I move to the left. You react to me, I move to the right, and I just keep moving back and forth. I've now created a cadence where you're following me and you're reacting to my movements. I'm now ahead in the race, and then I start maybe hand fighting at that point as I continue moving left and right and recognizing, how tall I'm standing upright, if I'm giving you the ability to access my legs, all sorts of things, okay? So that would be a great place to start in terms of learning. I'm moving left and right. I'm developing, again, in the procedural lens, I'm firing the neurons within my procedural memory system that are just moving left and right. How simple is that? Super, super easy. And then we build off of that. So we recognize either ourselves, where we're at in our own development, or as coaches, we recognize that line where our students, it's like, hey, they can get to this point, but at that particular point, that's where they start showing a deficiency in skill. And so deliberate practice in this lens of, the brain and how it relates to procedural memory is finding that point where you are proficient up till this level. And this is probably pretty intuitive. I think a lot of learning tends to be intuitive, although sometimes it's not at all. Maybe I'm on someone's back and I'm finding it hard to secure the rear naked choke, which is, a constant problem no matter how skilled you are. You can then say, okay, I can reliably get to someone's back, which that skill by itself is much more important than finishing the rear naked choke. But now that I'm on their back, man, I'm having a killer time of how to actually finish this particular submission. So that's the line. It's like, I've developed this, forgive me on the ridiculous terminology that I'm probably just creating on the spot, but I've developed this neuronal tree, okay, or this neuronal scaffolding that has got me to the point where I can do certain things effectively, but eventually I hit a wall. And when I hit that wall, not necessarily a wall, it's probably not so well delineated, it's probably gray, but I hit that point where I need to continue developing. And as a good coach or as a good student, you're going to recognize, hey, I'm going to go into practice, I'm going to go into open mat, and I've realized that when I go to pass the guard, I can get into the knee cut position, and then I'm transitioning to an X pass, and then I transition to a leg drag. And, it's at that point when I transition to the leg drag where my opponent is just constantly high legging me, and they constantly reset their guard. And at that point, I don't really have a way to progress forward. I don't really know what I'm doing. That right there would be deliberate practice. I know where I'm getting. I know how far I can get reliably, but it's this one little exchange that's causing me issues. And you can use that, cognitive side of things. You can get that feedback from your coach. You can get that breakdown on what they see happening to enable you to effectively use your training to focus on that procedural system. How do I create a little battle that helps me to focus on that very narrow skill set, that tiny little space where I'm clearly at a deficit in terms of my relative skill? Okay, so maybe you create a game, call it whatever you want. You create a scenario that allows you to develop that specific skill, right? It doesn't matter what terminology you use. It doesn't matter how you approach it. It's just you've recognized that you've gotten so far with your procedural memory and you're at a point where, okay, now I want to build off of these. I want literally in your brain, you want the neurons that are existing there to be reaching out to try to find the next connection to build that neuronal tree, to build that structure. So it's, hey, I'm trying to find an answer to this question. I'm firing. Oh, I found it. I made a connection. I made a new connection between neurons. It's a literal physical thing that happens. And that connection gets strengthened over and over and over with practice. You can strengthen the wrong connections, which is where something like that information processing, that cognitive coaching can become really useful. And because I'm ranting as much as I am, I might as well continue. Another thing to really consider here is in this sort of dichotomy between information processing and like more of an eco approach. If you have someone in a position where it's pretty predictable what their response will be, like you have them in mount or you have their back or something where they only have a limited number of really good options, in those scenarios, having a coach actually break down what's happening, again, overusing the term, but cognitively in that moment can be extremely useful. It's like, hey, throughout the age of our sport, obviously not including the many hundreds of years that we've been grappling, or our animals have been grappling, the 30 years or so of jiu-jitsu as we know it in modern history, we can use everything that's been learned to say, hey, this actually works really well in this scenario. And I can explain that to you as a coach. And again, I'm talking specifically to scenarios where there isn't a lot of chaos. It's pretty structured. It's pretty linear. In those scenarios particularly, I'm trying to learn how to finish a heel hook. I've got control of your ankle. And I'm like, oh man, I just can't quite get the mechanics correctly. It's like, yeah, there are a variety of ways that you could approach this. Someone could coach you to create some form of I'm going to call it situational sparring, a little mini game that allows you to work on the particular skills that are required to finish that heel hook. But you could also have an instructor say, hey, if you put the toes in this particular position and you pinch the side of your arm in this way and you position your body weight in this way, that can be a really effective way. I mean, I think it's kind of wild that it even has to be said. That can be a really effective way of learning, particularly in those linear scenarios where there isn't a ton of variability. All right. I kind of went off there. I said a lot of different things, but I don't know. I want to make sure I share at least the main ideas before we finish up.
Absolutely. Well, you know what? You talked about ecological dynamics, and I think this is probably as good a time as any to tie this together. A lot of people who are familiar with that framework might listen to what you've said and say, Cal, it sounds like to some extent you're talking about the ecological approach. And I know we haven't spoken about this before, and it's been a while since we've dug deep into this topic on the podcast here. So maybe this is an opportunity to ask you, what is your explanation of what eco is and how it fits into jiu-jitsu, and how does that jive with the other things that you've talked about here in this conversation? Is there any overlap? Are there any areas of conflict? I would just love to get your perspective on this, because I know this is a challenge for a lot of people first getting into ecological dynamics for the first time.
I wish I could approach this with ultimate conviction and have no uncertainties in my perspective. But unfortunately, I'm much more on the other side of the scale, where I'm going to give you nothing for certain and give you very little insight into what I think about these things, because I don't really know the depths of eco. I can't position myself as an expert. I know that the ecological approach, it emphasizes adapting to the environment. It focuses on basically perceiving and exploiting what are referred to as affordances in that environment, right? And I mean, regardless of what that entails, I don't know. I honestly don't like using the specific terminology, because I feel like it demonstrates a lack of understanding when you can't use a different set of words to describe the same thing. So the most, I think, effective thing I can share here is the ecological approach, as I understand it, was designed through observation of practice. So seeing what worked over time. It was a study of, hey, if we recognize that if we coach in this particular way, it results in people retaining these more so procedural memories much more effectively than using other methods, right? And I'm sure that depends on a lot of assumptions. Now, so that's a method of observing what's happening and then saying, hey, over time, this seems to have benefited these athletes in terms of developing their skill in a shorter period of time. And again, please take this with a grain of salt. I do not think of myself as anywhere near an expert on the ecological approach. Now, where I can, I think, shed a little bit of light is what I'm referring to is more so what actually happens inside the body to encode those memories. So regardless of how you approach your training, you're trying to develop that memory system that is referred to as your procedural memory system. You're trying to develop that automaticity in your movements. Regardless of how you go about it, what it is you're firing neurons in an exchange. And the more frequently that you fire those neurons, the stronger that connection becomes. Again, this phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together, it's an extremely interesting phrase that is applied in a broad number of situations when it comes to the brain. I've found in my limited research and experience in the space that it is one of the most concrete pieces of information that you can apply to certain things. And so regardless of how you approach it, if you take the ecological approach, if you take this IP, this information processing approach, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to fire the right neurons that are associated with that particular movement, that particular exchange. So you can create a training environment in a variety of different ways that allow for that to happen. You can use the ecological approach as a means of creating these scenarios where athletes then develop the skills, and those skills are memories in your procedural system that allow you to replicate that moving forward. So when something happens, you know how to react, you know how to respond in a particular moment. Okay, so I mean, that's as deep as I can go in terms of the ecological approach. It's more, this was developed as in parallel to sort of what we're learning more and more about the brain and learning through a lens of understanding what's actually happening in the brain, right? So these things are, I mean, obviously they're related. And I think that the research in both of these fields, it agrees with the opposite field, whatever, opposite's a terrible term there, but these things agree. The more we learn about the ecological approach, the more we learn about the brain, it seems like they're aligned. It seems like, hey, yeah, this is actually a pretty effective way of having the brain achieve this particular outcome, right? But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use other methods. That doesn't mean that, so information processing is often thought of as kind of, the other side of the coin. And this is more like the brain sort of acting like a computer, taking in information, processing it, and outputting decisions to coordinate your movement, right? So regardless of how you approach it, what we're trying to achieve is building, like, I don't know, these terms are kind of ridiculous, but like this neuronal scaffolding. You're firing certain neurons. Imagine just like a weed or a tree, right? It's like shoots up through the ground and then it expands and it expands and it expands. And as I understand it, that's a pretty accurate representation, at least in terms of simplifying it so you can visualize it, or like a spider web. It's like you are firing a certain neuron, and then that neuron is reaching out and it connects to another one and another one and another one. And the more frequently that you fire all of those neurons at the same time, the stronger that memory becomes. That becomes a highway between those neurons. Instead of it being like something that's barely achievable, where one's trying to reach out and find another one, you create these crazy strong highways of memories in your procedural system. So you can use the eco approach, you can use the IP approach, dependent on the scenario, dependent on what makes most sense for you at the time, but just try to consider what you're actually trying to achieve. It's not necessarily about the method that you're using to achieve it, it's about the result. And the result is, I want my brain to essentially automatically respond in certain scenarios. So I want to create a training structure that allows for that to happen. And hey, no fault to the ecological approach. It's absolutely, as far as I understand, very valid and a very effective way of making that happen. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways and there aren't other methods that will also benefit you. And using it all together, I'm sure, like anything else, a balance of different methods is going to yield the best result. And I will just mention, just briefly to tie this in, I know that visualization is actually something that has been shown to benefit athletes, right? And that's an interesting thing, because in this conversation about cognitive and procedural learning, visualization, like, that's using your conscious brain. I'm like consciously trying to think about, what would I do? Really random personal note. When I fall asleep at night, how I fall asleep, I practice jujitsu in my head. I lay in bed and I focus on jujitsu and I'm like, oh, what would I do if I was an half guard? I'm going to move like this, I'm going to move like that. And I find it helps me fall asleep. I fall asleep to that pretty much every single night. I'm like, my brain is busy from the day. I start thinking about jujitsu. So we know that visualization actually does fire some of the neurons in that procedural memory system. So in some way, you're using your cognitive brain to actually fire neurons that are generally only used in practice where you have physical resistance. And that's typically more of an expert or more advanced method, because you have to have those structures to be able to fire them. You have to know what you're going to do in terms of like what you're thinking about in order to actually fire those structures. You can't not have a structure and fire it. So it might be something that's more relevant to more experienced people. But my point is that there is crossover between these things. And I don't know the depths of that. I've tried to learn more about it. I don't know of a ton of information that's available there. Maybe someone's listening and they're like, Cal, you are an idiot. You're explaining this completely incorrectly. Let me come on here and straighten the record. Please do. I would love to learn more. And I think it would benefit the community as a whole if we could, I don't know, look at this from another angle, look at this, create another mental model, not be so rigid about one particular approach, and also be open to feedback and criticism so that we can continue to grow as a community rather than, holding on to these ideas and be like, no, it's got to be this way, or it's got to be that way. That's absurd. Come on. It's not an elementary school. I think that, I don't know, I guess I'm going off with different tangents here, but I just think we could, as a community, take a little bit more of a balanced approach, a more mature approach to these ideas and help building each other up and building up the community.
Now, let me ask you, how do we tie all of this together? We've covered a lot of material here in this chat. And if I put myself in the perspective of someone listening to this, particularly someone who's maybe newer in their jiu-jitsu journey, how can they apply this? So if someone says, yes, Cal, this all sounds good. I understand what you're saying. I too want to grapple more automatically. How can someone systemize and apply these concepts, alter their training, and see the benefits of what you're talking about?
Totally. Well, if we're talking about someone who has really never trained before, the idea would be, as I was kind of saying before, to start with really gross movement patterns. So movements that are replicated in a variety of situations within jiu-jitsu. So, and I'm not talking about doing these movements necessarily in an isolated fashion, although you could do isolated movements. So it's like I said, if I'm working on a particular skill set, there are essentially, let's call it 6 different skill sets, okay? There's the exchange of passing and guard retention. There's sweeping as the bottom player and maintaining your balance as the top player. There's controlling someone from the top position. There's controlling someone from the back. And then there's the inverse of those things. There's the escape portion. There's also turtle, front headlock. There's some wrestling stuff, whatever. I went off on a few different things there. Maybe it's not 6, but that's the general idea. So within the variety of these major exchanges, right, within jiu-jitsu, you want to start your training in a way where you're developing gross movement patterns in each exchange. So you learn the most broadly applicable movement, learning how to move side to side, learning how to change your level, right? Learning how to change your level while keeping your posture strong. So it's kind of hard to just give a one-size-fits-all, this is how you approach it. To be frank, this is exactly what I put together with Stephan Kesting. This is what the instructional is about. It's how to start from the beginning. And, I guess it's fair enough for me to plug that right now. That's exactly what I've created. And honestly, I spent an obsessive amount of energy and time learning from primarily Rob Biernacki, who I know that your listeners know, and who is a ridiculously dedicated student of jiu-jitsu. And I had the crazy fortune of learning from this guy for now well over a decade. And I was able to translate that partly into this instructional, plus my own learning, my own experience with different types of athletes, adults, kids. And that's what we created. And really what it starts with is, these are the main exchanges within jiu-jitsu. These are the main skill sets you need to learn. Let's learn the most broadly applicable movements for each one of these skill sets so that we build a foundation that starts with skills that are transferable between positions and between different exchanges. And then we get more and more granular as we become more and more experienced. Because the idea is, at some level, there's a bit of an objective level of jiu-jitsu where you have to be able to do a certain number of things. Again, you have to be able to bridge, right? You have to be able to, bump someone with your knee. You have to be able to control your center of gravity, move side to side, squat down into a pretty low position like a combat base, something like that, right? You have to be able to do a variety of things that everyone in jiu-jitsu does. But after you build that base, that broad base of skills where we know that we're using movements that have been proven to be very effective for a very long period of time, then you can get really specific on how you want to develop your game. You can see where you naturally gravitate towards, and then you can sort of take control of your own training, work with your coach, work with instructionals, that sort of thing, and say, what I naturally want to do is I want to move in this direction. And sometimes you might just be wrong. Your coach might just be like, honestly, I would recommend not doing that. But for the most part, one of the most beautiful things about jiu-jitsu is discovering your own game, right? So I'm going off on a tangent here, but when we talk about practically how to actually use this, what I'm picturing in my head is that neuronal structure, that neuronal map. We start with something basic. We start with movement, side-to-side movement. We start with keeping our elbows tight to our body, learning how to bridge. If I'm in turtle, my elbows are tight to my body. Maybe you're using a resource like Prit to learn about the turtle position. Take a look at what happens there. You learn turtle from the bottom, the basic idea of keeping your elbows tight, of bumping your opponent, and then of sitting to guard. You learn these A-B options that are very, very simple. And then once you learn that basic framework, then you can choose kind of what you want to learn from there. But you have that foundation of core skills, fundamental skills that have been proven to work for a very long period of time. You see them replicated constantly if you watch professional jiu-jitsu. And so, I don't know. I suppose I went off on a few more tangents there, Steve, but does that encapsulate it to a degree?
I think so. It's something, man, I keep plugging this guy. In The Art of Learning, Josh Waitzkin calls this concept making smaller circles. And the idea is you want to take this thing you're working on and shrink it down to be hyper-focused on the pieces that truly matter, the real fundamentals, and master the shit out of those. And then you can start bolting other things on top of it. So as you talked about, there are some fundamental movements that are always going to be the same and always important in jiu-jitsu. Once you master those, then you can start bolting on all of the what ifs and the variations and the fancy stuff. And this is something that the ecological dynamics people really understand well. They would call this invariance, and they build games around focusing on those invariants and training those. And then from there, all of the what ifs, they kind of shake out in the wash. They emerge organically. So I think that's a great way to hyper-focus your training, make the fundamentals automatic. And then from there, once you can do that, once the fundamental movements are automatic, all of the little variations become way, way easier. I'm sure you have found this. I remember when I was a white or a blue belt, learning anything new in jiu-jitsu was a real process because everything was so new to me and I had to really sit down and think about every single detail. Whereas now, as a black belt, if someone shows me a new technique, I could say, oh, it's like this thing I already do, but with one or two variants. And so it's a lot easier for me to just grab new stuff, apply it immediately, or also reject it immediately. Sometimes I can just look at a move and I can say, I know that's not going to work for me because I've already tried 10 other things that are very similar. Or I can say, I know that this is exactly my kind of move because it will align with all of this other stuff I'm already doing. So I think great advice overall. And again, I'll put resources and links to all of the stuff in the show notes. Again, what is your instructional called on Grapplearts, just for the record here?
BJJ Foundations.
Amazing. And so I will put a link to that in the show notes. But Cal, any other things that we should plug while we have you here? Any other resources or ways for people to contact you that you want to promote while I've got you?
Honestly, not so much. I'm open to people reaching out. I think on the instructional, I gave my email out. I'm not very active on social media by any stretch, but I am happy to chat with people about this. I'm not going to plug my email because I think that's ridiculous. I still have a Hotmail address. It's cal.mcdonald, McDonald, @hotmail.com. If you'd like to reach out, I'd be more than happy to chat.
I'm not going to plug it, he says, and then immediately plugs it.
Yeah, well, there you go. I figure I should be reachable in some way and not be completely disconnected. But yeah, I just want to mention just real quick, because what came to my mind there, Steve, when you were talking about focusing on certain movements, becoming really good at those movements. I'm all about, the fundamental is kind of a catch-all. It's a bit of a term that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but what comes to my mind is really the Bruce Lee quote. It's either one kick 10,000 times or 10,000 kicks once, right?
It's, I do not fear the man who has practiced 10,000 moves once. I fear the man who has practiced one move 10,000 times.
Exactly. And when it comes to these fundamental movements, I see myself as really trying to do those fundamental movements 10,000 times. I want to have a crazy, legit fundamental game. And then a couple little branches here and there where I go off and I'm doing something that I might be considering more advanced. But that's kind of my lens, and that's the lens that I coach from. That's the lens that I developed this instructional with, really focusing on how to make the most of those fundamentals. Because really, it's the most likely way you're not going to be led down some, road that isn't going to be productive for you. These are the most proven things. These are things that have been shown to be most effective. And so that's what it reminds me of. And I think that quote relates very well to what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to develop those neuronal highways, if you will, and that would be one kick that you've practiced 10,000 times.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Cal. Like I said, I will put links to those resources in the show notes, as well as links to some of the content that we discussed here, like Daniel Kahneman's work, Josh Waitzkin's work. I'll include that in the show notes too. And of course, I'll include our stuff as well. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Almost 300 episodes of this thing now. We always try to make every episode timeless and educational. You can go back to day one when we recorded the first episode 5 years ago, and that material should be just as relevant as what we talk about today. We don't talk about a lot of current events or social drama on the podcast. That stuff has a very short shelf life. We always want to make sure that every episode is something that will be timeless and always be valuable, something you can always come back to as being helpful. Our newsletter is getting close to 10,000 subscribers. I definitely recommend signing up for that as well. It's free. Of course, you can unsubscribe at any time. Join that and you'll get expanded show notes on the podcast. You'll get thought pieces every week. And we also give away free instructionals to the people who sign up there every once in a while too. So I always want to give the value back. But of course, all of this is powered by BJJ Mental Models Premium. That is how we pay the bills. Go to bjjmentalmodels.com and you can learn more. But to give you a quick understanding of what you'll get there, we've built out what I believe to be the world's biggest collection of jiu-jitsu audio masterclasses. Everyone else does video. I love audio as an approach because it allows me to talk about the stuff that we talked about here today, Cal. We can talk about big ideas and exchange of conceptual information. I have always found that with a lot of video instructionals, they're very limited in terms of what they can achieve. Yes, you can get an idea of what a person is doing with their hands and their feet, and you can copy that. But as I think we talked about here, there's a lot more to learning than just watching what someone else is doing and copying it verbatim. So what we offer is more akin to masterclass, for example, where we talk about a lot of big concepts and big ideas. And a lot of people really resonate with that approach. I can tell you people have won world championships by joining Premium and following that material. So I definitely recommend giving that a try. We also have premium podcasts that you can only get on our BJJ Mental Models Premium. For example, Emily Kwok and Johannan host an amazing podcast called The Highest Levels. They just had Marcelo Garcia on as a guest recently. Drew Foster also has a podcast where he breaks down the modern competition meta. He's an amazing analyst too, and all of that stuff is included. And of course, if you go up to our coaching tier, you will even get rolling reviews from our black belt review team. Quite literally some of the best black belts in the world. I believe our review team is about a dozen black belts, and they've collectively won about 20 world championships. So I defy anyone to get that kind of coaching for cheaper somewhere else. And if you're not sure, the first week is completely free, so you can try it out at no risk. BJJMentalModels.com is where you learn more. I will put a link in the show notes. And again, I just can't thank everyone enough for giving the service a try. It is ultimately how we justify this project and how we pay the bills. I know a lot of people say they love the free content. Well, you probably noticed we don't run ads here. The free content only exists because of premium subscribers. So I always encourage people to get on there and support us. BJJMentalModels.com for more information. But Cal, man, great to finally catch up again. It's been a long time. The last chat we had really stuck with me, not just because your nose started bleeding spontaneously, but also because you've got such a great way of explaining this stuff. You're such a great speaker, and I really appreciate your attempt to find some of this other information and bring it back to jiu-jitsu and show people how it's relevant to their training as well. So big thank you to you for coming by. Hope the instructional is doing well, and I definitely recommend everyone pick that up if they haven't already.
Thanks so much, Steve. You're doing amazing things for the community. Hugely appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Hope some people got a little bit out of this, and I hope to chat with you soon.
You too, buddy. Same with the listeners as well. Really do appreciate everyone hanging out with here weekly with us. I know it's a lot of time, and I know people have a lot of things on the go, so it really truly does mean something to me that people spend their time here with us versus other places. Thanks a lot to all of the listeners. Thanks to you, Cal, and we'll talk to you guys next time. Take care.